genetic reconstruction process took exactly 73 hours, which gave the Hegemony research team plenty of time to place bets on what their resurrected Neanderthal would do first. The leading theory proposed by Dr. Kethmore of the Zentoran Biological Institute was that it would immediately attempt to fashion crude weapons from whatever materials it could find. The second most popular hypothesis suggested it would try to start a fire, because apparently all primitive species were obsessed with combustion. What actually happened was that the being who would later be designated as Subject N1, though Elena had taken to calling him Grok in her personal notes, because sometimes the obvious names were the most honest ones, opened his eyes, assessed his surroundings with the methodical precision of a seasoned engineer, and promptly pretended to be unconscious for another 6 hours while he figured out exactly what kind of situation he'd awakened into. This level of strategic thinking was not anticipated in the Hegemony's behavioral models for primitive humanoids. Vexthara watched through the observation deck's reinforced transparent aluminum as Grok finally awakened for the second time, this performance accompanied by appropriately confused grunting and wide-eyed staring at the ceiling. The Neanderthal sat up slowly, his movements careful and deliberate, taking in every detail of his sterile containment chamber with what appeared to be simple curiosity. Remarkable preservation of motor functions, Vexthara noted into her recording device. Subject appears disoriented, but physically intact. Muscle mass is considerably greater than anticipated from the skeletal remains. Dr. Kozlov, your species' ancestors were remarkably robust. Elena stood beside the alien commander, her arms crossed tightly across her chest as she watched Grok examine the walls of his containment unit. There was something in the way he moved that made her deeply uncomfortable, not the shambling confusion of a primitive mind trying to process advanced technology, but the focused attention of someone conducting a very thorough reconnaissance. Commander, I really think we should proceed with extreme caution here. Neanderthals weren't just physically stronger than modern humans. They had larger brain capacity, more developed frontal lobes. They were problem solvers. Yes, Dr. Kozlov, you've mentioned their supposed intelligence several times, Vexthara replied with the patience of someone humoring a nervous parent. But intelligence is relative. They may have been clever for their time period, but they're still dealing with technology that's 40,000 years beyond their comprehension. As if responding to this assessment, Grok stood and walked to the containment field generator embedded in the chamber wall. He studied it for several minutes, his thick fingers tracing the air just outside the energy barrier's perimeter. Then he picked up the food dispenser they'd provided, a simple mechanical device designed to be intuitive for primitive minds, and began systematically dismantling it. Fascinating, Dr. Kethmore observed from his position at the monitoring station. Subject is exhibiting tool modification behavior. This suggests higher cognitive function than we initially projected. Elena felt her anxiety spike as she watched Grok work. His movements weren't random or frustrated. They were purposeful, methodical, like someone who understood mechanical principles and was testing a hypothesis. Within minutes, he'd converted the food dispenser into something that looked suspiciously like a probe designed to test the containment field's electrical properties. Commander, Elena said urgently, he's not just playing with that device. He's reverse engineering it. Impossible, Vexthara dismissed. The subject has been conscious for less than 12 hours. No primitive species could grasp hegemony technology that quickly. Grok inserted his improvised probe into a junction point where the containment field met the chamber's power grid. The energy barrier flickered once, twice, then stabilized at roughly 60% of its original strength. He nodded to himself with what could only be described as professional satisfaction. The alarm started 30 seconds later. What followed was a masterclass in why the Hegemony's xenobiological protocols had never been tested on species that had survived multiple ice ages through sheer adaptability. Grok didn't rage against his confinement or throw himself at the barriers like the primitive beast they'd expected. Instead, he systematically identified and exploited every single weakness in a containment system designed by beings who'd never had to deal with a species that viewed impossible problems as interesting puzzles. The first breach occurred when Grok discovered that the chamber's atmospheric recycling system could be accessed through a maintenance panel that wasn't properly secured. The second happened when he realized that the observation deck's transparent barrier was actually a two-way communication system that could be overloaded by creating specific harmonic frequencies with pieces of dismantled equipment. By the time the third containment failure cascaded through the station's primary power grid, Vexthera was beginning to suspect that her assumptions about primitive intelligence might require some revision. All security teams to level 7, the station's AI announced with the sort of calm that suggested it hadn't quite grasped the full scope of the problem. Containment breach in Xenobiology Lab 3. This is not a drill. Elena watched through the chaos as Grok emerged from his compromised chamber, moving with the fluid confidence of someone who'd spent his entire existence adapting to hostile environments. He wasn't running blindly through the corridors. He was navigating with purpose, heading directly toward the station's central hub, as if he'd memorized the layout from studying the air circulation patterns. "How is he doing this?" Vexithara demanded, her forearms dancing frantically across her control interfaces. "Our behavioral models predicted confusion, fear, basic survival instincts, not strategic planning." "That's what I've been trying to tell you," Elena said, her voice tight with a mixture of vindication and terror. "Neanderthals weren't failed humans. They were apex survivors. They had to be smarter, stronger, and more adaptable than anything else in their environment, or they died, for hundreds of thousands of years." The implications of this statement were beginning to penetrate Vexthera's consciousness like ice water through a cracked hull. The Hegemony had built their entire assessment of humanity on the assumption that modern humans represented the pinnacle of their species' development. But if humans were actually a hybrid of their own ancestors and these remarkably capable Neanderthals, then every calculation about human potential was fundamentally flawed. Grok appeared on the central hub's security monitors, standing calmly in the middle of what should have been an impenetrable control center, examining the station's main computer interface with the focused attention of someone reading a particularly interesting technical manual. He'd somehow bypassed 6 layers of security, disabled 3 separate containment protocols, and gained access to the station's primary systems in less than 2 hours. And he was doing it all while completely naked and operating on the technological knowledge of someone whose most advanced tool should have been a sharpened stick. "Commander," Elena said quietly, "I think it's time we stopped thinking of this as a containment situation and started thinking of it as a first contact scenario." Because the terrifying truth was becoming increasingly clear. Grok wasn't acting like a confused primitive trying to escape from incomprehensible alien captors. He was acting like an intelligent being who'd been kidnapped, imprisoned, and experimented on, and who was now conducting his own investigation into exactly who had done this to him and why. The Hegemony, Elena realized with growing horror, had just discovered that their assumptions about human evolution weren't just wrong. They were catastrophically, dangerously wrong. And now they were trapped on a space station with a representative of humanity's ancestral species who was considerably smarter, stronger, and more resourceful than anyone had bothered to consider. The galaxy's most advanced civilization had just learned the hard way that there's a significant difference between extinct and dormant.